Today, we're taking a look at what kills your retirement. It's time to look back at your portfolio with a different angle.
Fellow investors, bonjour! This is Mike Leroux, founder of Dividend Stocks Rocks and passionate investor. You're listening to the Dividend Guy blog podcast where I and my co-host Véronique will help you invest with more conviction so you can enjoy your retirement.
Dividend Growth investors, bonjour. Mike Leroux here. I hope you are doing well. Starting the month of October with Vero, my co-host, and a pretty interesting topic. How are you doing, Vero?
I'm doing good, Mike. As always, I think I'm always saying I'm doing good. So how about you?
I'm doing very bad. How about that? I know, it's kind of crazy. Imagine that, like when you start a podcast and I really feel depressed and I really don't want to record anything today. So let's go ahead and ask me a question.
Well, we'll try to keep the depression part for November, okay? Because
Okay.
that's
fair.
a hard month.
Yeah.
All right. So today, Mike, it's a special episode because we will use your personal and professional experience to prevent investors from killing their retirement. I mean, that's not like a small topic. So let's discuss the 5 biggest investment mistakes and what you've learned from them.
Yeah, so between 2007 and 2016, I worked at the National Bank as a financial planner. So half of that time, I was a financial planner in Montreal. The other half as a private banker just right beside my home in Granby. Over the years, I've met hundreds of clients and I've seen them, or at least wanted them, making so many mistakes. And I had some tough conversation with those. And today, well, hopefully we're going to have that tough conversation with you guys and that you will be able to take that as a friendly advice and not necessarily that I'm telling you what to do, but more like what I've seen that worked and didn't work over the past 10 years.
Mm-hmm. So the first mistake to discuss is waiting for a pullback. How did you experience that one, Mike?
Well, this one happens all the time. And actually, not too long ago, it's kind of crazy, but at the end of August, we had all the Canadian banks reporting their earnings. And once again, National Bank, big surprise, right? Reported amazing earnings. So the stock price flew above $125. And then a lot of investors, because of course I went on social media talking about it. I have even a YouTube video about this. And then so many investors told me, oh yeah, I was waiting for a dip. I wanted to have a better price for National Bank. So next time it trades around $100, I'm going to go in. And I've seen so many investors taking an arbitrary number, such as I'm going to wait until this stock that trades at 125. At 120, at 100, it's going to be a good deal. But in January of the same year, a lot of investors were telling me, oh, the National Bank is trading at $100. It's not going that high that much. I'm going to wait for a pullback at 90. So those are the same investors telling me that they're going to wait today at 100, and they're just going to continue. So I have a question for you, Véronique. Do you know when was the best time to invest in National Bank?
Nope.
And do you know when I started investing?
It must be a long time ago because I think it's one of your first holdings. So probably around 2010.
Actually, I started investing in 2003, and since I was working at the bank, National Bank was one of my first holding. And guess what? The best time to invest in National Bank, well, in my experience, was in 2003. It was exactly the same day that I started investing. We all want to grab shares at a cheap price. It makes an amazing story, of course, but really waiting like this, I'm pretty sure I'll never see 2003 stock price for National Bank. And if I see that, it will mean that National Bank is crashing and burning and nothing works anymore. And it's probably not the time to invest that anyways. So just a quick story here that whenever you wait for a pullback, it's going to always be based on some kind of an arbitrary number that you just put in your mind because it will make you feel good about that transaction. But it has nothing to do with the reality and what's going on.
But Mike, concretely, how does it hurt someone's portfolio in the long run?
Well, this one is hard to put a dollar figure or tell you how it hurts because most of the time, that's a story that nobody tells. If you pass on a good stock, you're just going to ignore it and say, well, I never bought National Bank. I could have bought it at 20 bucks. Now it's 125 and so well. But have you ever thought of calculating that opportunity cost? Because if you've been waiting for like 5 years with, I don't know, maybe 30% of your money, of your portfolio in cash, waiting for a major pullback, if it doesn't happen, well, you're never going to get the best price out of this. And even though right now you may be making like a 4 or 5% a year interest return on your cash, that wasn't the case between 2009 up to 2021, 2022. So
Mhm.
are you willing to wait for that long? And even then, I mean, you've been waiting, cashing a 5% yield on GICs. In 23, the market was up double digit. 24 seems to be pretty much on its way to be up double digit as well. You have to calculate those opportunity costs. The problem often is people are just looking at, oh, I'm making that 5%. And whenever I feel it's a good time, I will get back into the market. But the problem is when you're doing financial planning, you look at expected returns, right? So to generate that expected returns, you cannot go back in and go out and play around with the time in the market. You have to be in the market and endure. That means that sometimes you're buying at the wrong time. That's all right. And some other times you're just going to have a great deal. But over a long period of time, this is where you're going to reach that expected return. So if you are outside of the market for years like 23 and 24, that means you're missing on double digit returns, but maybe
Mhm.
25 will be down 15%. And if you finally decided to invest, well, you have missed 2 amazing years, and probably that small pullback will not be enough to compensate for those missing years. And if you push that for the next 20, 30, 40 years, because I mean, even if you're 25 today, you still have 20 years of investing about if you consider life expectancy at 85. This means that you're going to miss so many great years that eventually you're not going to generate the expected returns. And then you may not be able to retire with the lifestyle that you wanted.
Mhm. The solution seems pretty obvious, but still, what should investors do instead?
Yeah, I'm not going to come with my tagline right away, but I'm going to quote Wayne Gretzky on this one. You miss 100% of shots you don't take. And it's exactly the same thing if you don't invest, right? That's
Mhm.
the opportunity cost. So having a clear plan, focusing on a simple strategy, and you guessed it, staying invested will definitely make it happen. So you are going to go through market fluctuations, but in the end, if you want to have that expected returns coming from from equities, you have no other choice but to stay invested throughout the entire game. Now, if you're done with market fluctuations, if you cannot sleep well at night with that, that's also nice. That's perfect. You don't have to. But then if you get out of the market and you go for fixed income solutions, and it works with your retirement plan, don't ever come back and invest in stocks, because then again you may be investing at the wrong time and you're going to put your retirement plan at risk once again.
Okay, so I don't think that you're guilty of the next one, but maybe you'll surprise me. This mistake is to think it will bounce back. Do you have any story to share?
Well, I have plenty of stories of stocks that went down, but I'm pretty quick at getting rid of those. And that's a common mistake I've seen with so many investors, that they just see a stock going down on bad news, on a dividend cut or whatever. And then they're just thinking, oh, yeah, well, it used to trade at 20 bucks. Now it's trading at 10. So I'm going to wait and it's going to eventually come back at $20. Like, of course it will. And two stories come into mind, because those were the latest stocks that I got rid of at a big loss. Was Algonquin, AQN, and Sylogis, SYZ.
Mhm.
And then ironically, Sylogis is actually on a pretty solid comeback right now. So who knows? Maybe I could have recovered my entire loss. But the thing is, too often investors are willing to take that chance and they pile up on losers in their portfolio, thinking, Well, it doesn't matter anyway because I lost that money. So what's the point of like selling at a loss? I might as well just
Mhm.
keep it in my portfolio and wait for that like famous bounce back, which actually rarely happens.
Okay, but Mike, I'm tempted to add like a personal experience here. I used to hold like 3M and a couple of like bad choices. And what I did is I knew I wanted to sell, but then I waited just a couple of days for like the news to cool off a bit. And some people jump in and so the price goes back just a little, so it makes me feel a little bit better. But is this really like is this just like my emotion getting in the way?
It's definitely your emotion because the other way around could have happened, and you could have lost 2 or 3 more% instead of like recovering 2 3%. So it's not a bad thing because you still pull the trigger relatively fast. But
Mhm.
it's like my point is more about people that are dragging those for months or years. Because when a stock
Right.
price goes down by 50%, it's going to take like 100% return just to get back and break even, which is less likely to happen. And it could. I mean, you're bringing the 3M story. I'm just going to tell you not to look at the stock price these days because it is on a pretty good recovery path. So who knows, right? And
All
this is
right.
exactly what's killing people is we do have those anecdotes, we do have those examples where you get rid of a stock and then you come back later and you're just like, oh my god, it's coming back, I should have kept it. And the reason why you should focus on your rules instead and get rid of those is because for each time that you have a 3M story or a Salogist story, you're going to have like a dozen stories where the company went down and never recover. And
Mhm.
this is the odds. So, yes, it will happen from time to time. But if I look at all the stocks that I've left behind over the past 20 years, well, yeah, maybe 2 or 3 I should have kept. And the other 10 or 15 that I got rid of, well, that was a pretty solid move. And here's a good example with Algonquin, actually. I sold upon the dividend cut. And right after, the stock price started to come back a little bit. And then some investors were just like, see, I told you you should have waited, and now it's on recovery path, and then you just have like now the dividend is safe, the payout ratio makes sense, and in a few years you're gonna get your money back. Well, fast forward to this summer, they announced another dividend cut. The stock price fell big time, and yet I'm still better having sold in early 23 after the first dividend cut, putting that money to work elsewhere that is actually in a better investment instead of
Mhm.
like waiting, hoping, and eventually never happen. So we're going to have a lot more stories like Algonquin that are just keep on failing investors, aside than having like some of those like 3M small bounce back and then Sylogist. And then for the record, both have not fully recovered. They're just like showing some interesting trends. So maybe it's going to happen, but maybe not.
Mhm. Okay, so why can waiting for a bounce back kill a retirement?
So, first, too many losers in your portfolio will just drag your portfolio down in terms of returns. So, that's a bad thing. It's always better to get a cleaner version of your portfolio. Because one thing I've realized over time is a lot of investors, they open their brokerage account and then they see those red lines. They see, oh, yeah, I lost money on Sylogist, I lost money on Algonquin, and also I lost money on Shopify and on Canopy Growth. And the list goes on and on and on. So of course that affects your conviction in your ability to manage your portfolio and your strategy. You may even be starting to think, well, maybe I should change my strategy. Maybe I should go with
Mhm.
an advisor. Maybe I should go with ETF. And then it goes on and on and on. So having those constant reminder of a failure, I just don't see this as a good thing in your portfolio. I rather open my brokerage account and see more than 80% of my portfolio in the green. So then I feel good about
Right.
it. And I'm like, hey, you know what? I'm doing something right here. And eventually I feel more positive about my portfolio. And if any market correction happens, I will have the nerve to say, you know what? It's all good. it can go down. I know that my portfolio is great. I know that my strategy works, so I can move on. So if you keep on having all those losers in your portfolio, chances are you're going to take a longer time to take your decision. Again, the opportunity cost is going to wait in, because all the time that you wait for that stock to come back, you could have also said, well, my investment in this company is now worth $10,000. Where else I can invest $10,000 in the in my portfolio, and is it going to generate better returns than keeping it invested in that loser? Often the answer will be pretty clear that you should invest it elsewhere in a company with stronger fundamentals and a better narrative.
You kind of already answered that, but how can we fix this problem? Like, just give us maybe a quick summary.
Yeah, for the summary, I think the most important point here is to have clear investment rules. This is how I am so quick at getting rid of those losers. Is I do have those clear investment rules. The first one is, of course, sell on the dividend cut. I don't care what happens. My strategy is I invest in dividend growers. So if you're not a dividend grower, you're not for me. I don't care if I'm right or if I'm wrong. This is the strategy I decided to follow. And that's the ultimate point. You know, it's kind of funny because we had those discussions as well apart, but I've read a lot about like the keto diet and the fact that you have to focus just on like a specific set of nutriments to be able to lose weight. And the point about being a keto is it's not that it's like work or it doesn't work, but rather if you do it 100%, it will work. If you do it half time or you do it like 80% of the time, well, it's not going to produce the same results. So it doesn't really matter if you're right or wrong following that diet, but rather if you do it halfway, well, you're not doing it. You're like, you either do it or you don't. So it's the same thing with your portfolio. If you're just like, yeah, I'm a dividend growth investor, except for this one, except for that one, except for like 35% of my portfolio, well, you may not exactly be that. And it's not exactly your strategy. It's like someone citing Buffett and just ignoring the fact that he had like about 40% of its portfolio in Apple for like a decade, and you don't even have Apple in your portfolio. I mean, yeah, you maybe want to follow him, but you're not exactly doing what he's doing. So those things are super important in my mind. So sell on the dividend cut, move on. That's my number one rule. The second one is always make sure that my investment thesis, so the reason why I have this stock in my portfolio, is backed by fundamentals. So the numbers are telling you a story. The key point here is the story the same that the story you tell yourself? So if you're thinking, oh, this company is growing by acquisition, they are getting market shares, they're highly profitable, and then you look at the dividend triangle and you realize that revenues are almost flat and earnings are declining, well, certainly that company is not growing by acquisition anymore and it's less and less profitable. So the story you tell yourself is not the story that is backed by numbers, and therefore it's probably time to get rid of it. So I made it a bit more simplistic than it is, but down to earth, it's pretty much how you can achieve that level of conviction that you just get rid of those losers as fast as possible. You move on. And again, I told that many times on that show and on my webinars and everywhere. I never assess the value of an investment based on the stock returns that I got. So we're talking about losers here, but I will sell stocks if my investment thesis is not backed by numbers, even if I'm making money. It doesn't really matter. So it's not because I lost 50% on a stock that I'm going to sell automatically. It's a lot more about what's going on in that company, and I don't really care about the stock price.
Hey, dividend growth investors, this is Vero. Mike is currently taking a sip of water, which gives us 10 seconds, and I literally mean 10 seconds to grow the podcast together. Go on Spotify or Apple Podcast, hit pause, and then under our logo, you'll see two very interesting buttons. One to subscribe, hit that subscribe button now, and then give us a 5-star rating. You know, our goal is to help more investors just like you, so please spread the love. Thank you. Right. Okay, so the third mistake is the one I heard you talk about the most, putting income above all. Have you ever made it, Mike?
Uh, no, the closest to that mistake that I've done is when I started investing using a dividend oriented strategy. I had a minimum yield, so I thought,
Mhm.
well, if I want to become a dividend investor, I cannot really consider stocks with a yield under 3%. That doesn't really make sense. It's like pennies, right? And then I realized, oh, but what about this company that looks amazing but pays a 2.5% yield? Okay, so the narrative is good. The numbers are great, and then I decided, well, I might as well buy it. And then I eventually found a business offering a 2% yield and then a 1.5% yield. And then I realized that, yeah, I should never get yield as a minimum filter because it doesn't make much sense. But now, never focused on the high yield either. And that is kind of like one of my life mission here now, just on the show and across Dividend Stocks Rock. And I know I face a lot of reluctance from investors, and that
Mhm.
totally makes sense because, like I like to call it napkin calculation. You need $50,000 in revenue, so you invest $1 million at 5%, and then boom, you're golden. You don't have to do anything, and then that money flows in, and it feels good, right? It's easy to understand. You have this impression that you will not lose your capital. You don't have to touch it, so you're not going to lose it, and that dividend will magically continue to pay for your stuff, match inflation, and never going to be cut. So that's pretty much what most investors think when they're thinking about dividend. I wish it was that simple, and unfortunately, there's no free lunch in finance.
But why is it so harmful? What's to learn from it?
So, see, my youngest son Caleb, when he was a bit younger, he kept asking me about like, oh, like that's great, we just got this and it's free because he didn't like understand the concept of money. Of course, he was like below 10 when he was doing this, and every time he was like, if he didn't see me pay for something, he thought that it was for free, right? And then I told him, I mean, sorry, Caleb, to break it to you at such a young age, but nothing is free, my friend. You either pay with money or you pay with your time, but you're going to pay one way or another. So eventually he grew up, and then he's asking for a raise now. So I guess that he got the point of like nothing is free.
Inflation, Mike.
Yeah, that's it. Inflation. That even works with kids allocation. That's crazy. Yeah. So last year, I wrote a complete guide called Dividend Income for Life, explaining to my like the goal at first was to explain to my members why a stock offer or an investment product offers such a great yield, because it
Mhm.
it comes back over and over again where, oh, this company or this ETF or this fund or whatever, they're offering like 10%, 15% yield. It's amazing. I can retire on a lot less than that, so it's great. So I asked my members and I tried to explain that is, well, if you invest in a company with a high yield, it's because investors on the market in general have little interest in that company. So that's why the yield is so high. And probably there's a reason for this. And I remember in 22, I received a lot of questions about Zim Integrated. So Zim
That's right.
Integrated, ticker ZIM. I'm sure you remember because I covered
Mhm.
that for like, I think like for 3 months in a row in webinars. And people kept asking about this one. Like, but Mike, the yield, it's like, it was, I don't know, like 20% back then. It was just crazy. In 22, the stock reached a high point of $84 and paying a dividend, like one quarter, the dividend was $17. That's crazy. So it
Mhm.
was like, number one read on Seeking Alpha. It was all over the place, and I kept getting bugged about this stock, and I kept like saying the same thing, like, you know what, it's not sustainable, guys. It's gonna crash and burn. And we saw similar companies in a similar situation. That is a marine vessel business. We saw that in the past. It happened, very high yield, eventually crash and burn. Well, guess what happened? Today, Zim, good news, investors, if you're looking for it, Zim still offers a 19% yield. So that's amazing, right? There's just a problem though. At the end of August, the stock price was now $19. So you went from 84 to $19, and the dividend is now like $1. The last dividend was like less than $1. quarterly dividend, of course. So how many dividend payment? Let's say they keep it at $1, just to be very, very generous. How many years you need of dividend to cover that $60 loss if you bought in 22? Well, that would be 15 years to break even on a stock that you're not even sure if it's going to pay a dividend in 2 years from now. So yes, it pays a juicy yield, but that yield, I mean, if you thought that you could retire on like $17 per quarter per share on Zim back in 22, now you're like, you cannot even afford your craft dinner at $1 per share. So definitely not a good thing. If it's a product, it's not even better, because the key thing with a product, we're talking about link notes, ETFs, closed-end funds, whatever. The point is, do you understand where the yield is coming from and how it's built? Because if you don't, well, you may have to learn the hard way when the distribution get cuts. So that's, of course, the worst that could happen is you invest the money in the black box. The black box doesn't do what it's supposed to do. Surprise. Never happened, right? I mean, I got that all the time when I was a financial planner, because you get to meet with like fund managers and they explain you those like super fancy and complex strategies. And they almost make you feel like you don't quite get it. So it works, but you're just not smart enough to understand how it works. Right. And then there's a market crisis like 2008. And then, surprise, surprise, all of those products, they fell. I don't know why, but I mean, it's always the same thing. And of course, again, that's the worst case scenario. Another scenario that could happen all the time is, again, that opportunity cost. There's a lot of talk and a lot of like investors are like super thrilled to invest in those yield max ETFs that are working on options on popular stocks like NVIDIA, for example. So I decided to take the yield max on NVIDIA as an example. I could have taken like Tesla or any others. That would have been the same result. My point was, unfortunately, it is still very, very young. So it's hard to determine what's going to happen next. So the yield max on NVIDIA started trading around May 2023. So not that like about a year and a half ago, not that much. But the only reason why it works and it pays a great yield and the total return is like quite surprising, it's because NVIDIA is on fire. That's the only difference. And here's the thing. If you have invested $10,000 in May of 23 all the way down to the last day of August of 2024, so about a year and a half, that $10,000 in NVIDIA yield max would have been, at this point, assuming that you're reinvesting your dividend, $27,500. So pretty good investment. Kudos to you. But I probably prefer to invest in NVIDIA that would have taken that $10,000 and made it almost $44,000. So, I mean, just like $20,000 difference, like who counts, right? But just to show you that that's the only reason why the yield max is actually generating something is just because the underlying asset, the option you're taking on NVIDIA, you should have just let go of that fancy strategy and invest in NVIDIA. And then you're going to tell me, but Mike, we didn't know that NVIDIA would have skyrocketed like this. Fair point. I'm telling you, if it has not, and if it was a crash and burn, well, the yield max would have not be successful. And that is something that you keep on forgetting. So if NVIDIA doesn't transform $10,000 into 44 and it goes to like $12,000, well, the NVIDIA yield max will not go to $27,000 for sure. So you have to take that into consideration. The only driver here of growth is the stock price. So if the stock price goes down, your options not going to be great. And I did like a few videos about that. I've compared, like one that I really like to compare because I have a really long history is ZEB versus ZWB. So those are two ETF. Those are made by BMO, the same company. ZEB tracks the 6 Canadian banks, and ZWB does covered calls on the same 6 banks. And after like 12 or 13 years of existence, at no time, like up market, down market, flat market, the covered call ETF provided a better total return. Yes, better yield, of course, but never better total return. So for the sake of yield, you're getting less of what you thought you could have.
And by the way, listeners, I will put the links to the content we referred to in the show notes at thedividendguyblog.com/194. Mike, how can investors avoid that problem?
Well, I get that you're not necessarily going to follow my lead and go for like low yield, high growth stocks all the time. And that's good because that's my strategy. Doesn't mean that it has to be yours. Actually, you can find a lot of good options around 3, 4, 4.5% yield, a lot of them. But the principal message here is go for quality. Like forget about the yield. If you end up like finding like good yielders and that they have like an interesting investment thesis plus solid fundamentals, well, then go for it. But always go for the quality. So take a
Mhm.
little bit more time to look at the numbers, understand why a company has to offer you 6, 7, 8%, 10% yield. If you cannot figure it out, that's probably because you're missing something. That's okay. But if you want to go blindly in a stock that you don't understand, I see that as a really risky play, especially if you move towards retirement. So instead, if you go at a strong dividend triangle where a company shows revenue growth, earnings growth, and dividend growth, you will get less yield, but you will invest in a quality company that has good chance to continue to thrive going forward.
Okay, so holding too many stocks is the fourth investment mistake of today. It must be tempting for you, Mike, to always add more stocks since you spend so much time analyzing companies, right?
Yeah, and it's a common problem that a lot of investors have where the more you invest, the more it becomes interesting and like it transforms into a hobby like where I really enjoy looking at the stock market, finding new companies, and whenever I have the problem like the I don't know, the bad luck of finding a great business that I am interested in, but since I'm always 100% invested, I don't necessarily have the liquidity to buy it. I'm just like, oh, I want them all, you know. And then there's also a claim for diversification here because of course, some investors have like the guts to invest into like 5 or 10 stocks, which is amazing because that shows crazy conviction. But at the same time, you're not that diversified. So you better be right. So some
Mhm.
other investors are just like, yeah, I don't care if my stock crash and burns. I have like 98 others. So this one may be bad. I don't really care. And then you may be thinking, well, they're all safe because I once did the due diligence. I added it to my portfolio and now I feel good about it. So it is definitely tempting. But over the years, I was able to contain myself and always stay between 30 and 40 stocks. Never reached the 40 marks, actually, like sometimes 37, 38, but never more than that. And keep in mind, my job is like being 100% talking about the market all the time. So I could be able to follow like 50 or 75 stocks without any problems.
And how can holding over 40 stocks destroy a portfolio?
Yeah, I mean, at first it's kind of like counterintuitive because I made a pretty good argument that you have good diversification, you're exposed to different industries, and kind of makes sense. But the first problem I see here is you require a lot of time. So maybe you're busy, maybe you have like young children, maybe you have a demanding career, or maybe you're not that interested in following financial statements every quarter. And if you don't, well, you may miss on important information. And then I get that classic example of like Canadian banks, but over the years they are all different, and some of them these days over the past few quarters they're not necessarily reporting good news. So if you just thought,
Mhm.
well, BMO has been around for more than 100 years and has been paying a dividend for that long, so I don't have to look at it anymore and it's all going to be fine. Well, maybe you're going to miss one or two important stuff like their provision for credit losses has doubled in the past 4 quarters. Maybe you would like to know about that. But if you don't have the time to monitor your portfolio, you're going to skip those. The second thing is diversification. A lot of investors, they just love to have all stocks in a sector, but you're not diversified. You're just adding more salts to your soup, as I like to say. So if you
Mhm.
have 7 banks in your portfolio, you're just like 7 times exposed to the risk of having a mortgage crisis in your portfolio. do you really want that? Does it add any value? I mean, besides the fact that you have to follow 7 companies that are going to tell you something that is similar, but the same risk will apply. And if it happens, well, you're going to take it in the teeth. The third problem I see is the more you add stocks, the closer you get to an ETF. By design, it's not the end of the world, but at one point you may be just wondering, how about I get all my time back and just invest in one single ETF that would cover all my stocks and just pay a small fee and don't have to do anything else? Because, I mean, again, as I came back to my story with Caleb, you either pay with money or you pay with time. So as much as you may love following stocks, maybe at one point it's just not worth your time anymore. So that is one thing to consider as well. And for the last one, I would like to come with an example. So, Vero, I'm going to give you a race. Do you want it?
Sure.
So it sounds pretty cool, right? I mean, and I know you have like some projects. You want to buy a horse. You want to buy a horse and stuff. So I'm going to help you out. How about $5?
Okay, but $5 per hour?
Per hour? No, not per hour. Per week? No, not per week. Per month? Not even. I'm going to give you $5 per year.
That's not a race.
It's not a race at all, but that's pretty much what having a 0.32% position feels like in your portfolio. You know, like when you have like 100 stocks, you have like very, very small positions. And if that position double or triple or crash and burns, you're never going to notice. Same thing if I jump your salary by $5. But sorry for the hype, Vero. Not going to happen in both ways.
Okay, but Mike, how do you manage to hold yourself back?
Well, I use a good old minimalist rule. If one comes in, one must go out. It's tough, but it is really important at one point because it's so easy to get excited about the things you don't have. And that's not just true about the stock market, right? It's true pretty much about everything in life. So I try to focus once again on quality. So I want the best of the breeds. So I've developed the stock comparison tool on DSR that is helping me a lot to make those decisions. So if I look at a specific industry and I just want to select the best stocks, of course, you're going to tell me, but Mike, it's impossible. We don't know the future. Fair enough. I agree with you. But how about you go back and look at fundamentals, like numbers? Because, of course, the futures cannot be determined. But if you look at the past 5 years, you can see trends and you can see which company is doing better than another. And at one point, it makes it very easy just looking at the numbers to determine, okay, so this one is obviously a lot stronger than company B, and then you just go on. So I like to put fundamentals above all and keep that like 30 to 35 stocks. So ideally having like a 3% weight on each of my position as well. So I have like position that matters. Whenever they do something in my portfolio, I'm going to reap the rewards. Of course, I'm going to take the hit if it's on the other side, but at least I have the feeling that I'm working for something and it will bring value to my portfolio.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so last but not the least, did you ever focus on valuation, Mike? And what's your story about that one?
Well, I have a few ones on this one. Funny enough, when I was in university with my friends, Google IPO came out, and I remember that we were having lunch. We're all like talking about finance and stuff, and we're just like, "Ha! Those poor fools that are buying Google at $100. That's way too pricey. Those are stupid guys." And then later on, it was kind of interesting because I had one of my clients that massively bought Facebook on the IPO, and I kind of get like the hypes. I was like, all right, I didn't like say anything against that. And then like one of my colleagues was like, but Mike, what are you thinking about this? And I'm like, oh, no, I remember Google, so maybe he's going to be right. And it's his money, his mouth. I've been sitting on the sideline for Visa for I sit on the sideline for Visa for many years before I pulled the trigger, just because it was trading at a high PE ratio. And my favorite one was when I bought Microsoft in 2017. Back then, the stock price was trading around $75. And pretty much all analysts, people on Seeking Alpha, people at FastGraph. There's also even like videos by the founder of FastGraph explaining why Microsoft is greatly overvalued at $75. Thank God I didn't listen to those, right? Because that was pretty much the best way to skip on triple digit returns is to focus on that valuation. And a little bit, I'll kind of like circle the loop where we started the episode talking about waiting for a pullback because everything is like not the right price. Well, that comes also with valuation. So you have to be very careful when you're coming with valuation along the way. And unfortunately, there's no clear way to determine the valuation of a stock, the value of a stock. So if you put like 50 CFAs in a room and you ask them to give me a fair value for Microsoft, you're going to have like 50 different answers. So if those guys that are like well paid for their job, so if you think you're better than them, well, I mean, go for it because you're going to make like $500,000 a year plus. So I don't know what you're waiting for, but I'm pretty sure that a lot of people are not making that in a year. But those guys do, and they cannot wrap their head around the right stock price for Microsoft in a year from now because there's so much unknown that even if you come with those fancy calculation, it doesn't make difference.
All right, but why is it something to avoid, and how do you prevent it? Because I mean, I know I can hear a lot of investors saying right now, but Mike, we don't want to pay too much either, right?
Yeah, and it is actually a pretty valid point, and this is where it gets tricky. Going back to Microsoft, and I'm going to use Walmart example as well. Before the tech bubble, those two stocks were trading at a crazy PE ratio, pretty much like the highest they ever traded at. And for like 10 years after, they didn't generate any value. Even though they were generating more revenue, more earnings, it didn't matter. They were priced at such a high PE ratio that no investors wanted to get in. So you would have a dud for 10 years. And we're talking about two great companies here. So I get the point of like overpaying. And that will, like, if you pay with a very, very rich valuation, you're not going to get any returns out of that. And I totally agree. So you cannot just close your eyes and just jump in and then start buying. Instead, though, you can look at the average PE ratio and the average dividend yield. So if you look at the past 5 and 10 years, you're going to have a pretty good feeling of how the stock market value a specific company. So the point is not to go or not go if the PE ratio is at 30. But if the PE ratio is at 30 and it has been trading around 30 times the earnings over the past 5 and 10 years, well, chances are it is the value and you have to pay for quality. Visa is a pretty good example of that. It's pretty much always trading at a similar valuation ratio, but it's always steep. So, but in the end, the company is growing double digit, pretty much clockwork every quarter. So it's kind of like hard to say, well, it's overpriced. Well, it's going to continue to be overpriced for several years going forward. A good example of a stock that seems very pricey right now would be Costco, though, because the average is 35, 40 times the earnings. Now we're going above 50 times earnings. So definitely this one, I would be a bit uncomfortable to pull the trigger at this point. I would probably do it anyway, but at that price, you will have to be very, very patient going forward. Because if they go with a few bad quarters and say, well, we're not able to open new warehouses anymore and people are not coming to Costco and they're not renewing their membership, well, then you will have a big problem. So it's always a balance between looking at what makes the company so great. So what are the chances that Costco can continue to open new warehouses? Have they saturated the market yet? And is the renewal rate for their membership is slowing down? So if everything is very solid, well, then probably that paying 55 times the earnings for Costco, kind of crazy, but still could make sense. But again, if you feel that this one is way too much, you can skip on this one and buy the next stock on your list. I guess that if you're just looking to get your number for the calculation, well, your calculations are based on assumptions, and assumptions are based on wild luck. So you might as well just go for quality instead, because your system is not any better than any other CFAs out there, and they're still not able to figure that out. So I wonder how you and me both, we can do that on our inner basement.
All right. So, among your biggest mistakes, Mike, is there another one that you'd like to share today?
I'm going to go with a personal one on this one. I'm going to surprise you, but I tend to be overconfident.
Right? Oh,
Yeah.
I didn't notice.
Well, I mean, that's I see that as a quality, but sometimes it is definitely a flaw because it reflects on all aspect of my life, including investing. So sometimes I'm just like, yeah, that's a bad quarter. I don't care. Let's move on, and it's gonna all be fine. But that cost me dearly over time because, of course, it's not always that easy. And being confident that the company will turn around, that management is competent, that the dividend will continue to increase. Yes, it's great to invest with conviction, but sometimes I wish I would go back a little bit more towards the number instead.
Mhm. And what have you learned from it?
Well, first, management doesn't have your interests at heart. They just have their job and maybe the company's at heart, but that's pretty much it. So sometimes they will make harsh decisions, such as cutting down the dividend, even if the numbers are not that bad, but they're just thinking about how they will save the company. And it's not necessarily aligned with your retirement plan. So over time, what I've learned is to calm down a little about my enthusiasm for a company and just go back to the numbers, like go back to something that doesn't move, like that just tells me the cold hard truth of like what's going on right now. And if I had done that with Algonquin, for example, I would have realized that I should have put more focus on the funds from operation per share that was declining, the interest charges that was climbing up way too fast, instead of thinking the company is still in a good shape. They just increased their dividend a few months ago. Management is not dumb enough to increase their dividend and then realize 6 months later that they're making mistakes. Well, that's what happened. So following the numbers is probably the best way you could avoid this kind of problem.
All right, so let's end with this. How can the stock checklist help investors to avoid these investment mistakes?
Yeah, so we've built a small checklist that you can download. Guess the link description below, right? That link will be in the show notes.
Sure.
The reason why we created that checklist is most of the mistakes and bias that we have discussed today are directly linked to our emotions and our brains telling us stories. So instead of like falling in love with a stock, falling in love with a story, well, you need to find a way to protect your portfolio from yourself. And going back to full rational, like yes or no questions, going down to the facts and going down to numbers is definitely the best help you could do. And going with a checklist, I mean, you have no other choice. It's not like yes, but no, it's yes or no, and that's it. So at the end of the story, you're going to spend like 5 minutes completing the checklist for a stock. And then you're going to see if the facts are backing your story or you're just living in a dream and maybe it's time for you to wake up.
And a synonym to the checklist is like a cheat sheet, but don't cheat and put like your mark in between. Like do it seriously and it's going to help you a lot. So the link is thedividendguyblog.com/checklist to download it for free. Thank you, Mike, for being so transparent about your own experience and mistakes. For the show notes and related content, visit thedividendguyblog.com/194. Next week, we'll share a simple strategy to get you covered from all angles. Hit the subscribe button now to avoid missing it. And until then, stay invested.
Hey fellow investors, it's Mike here. I hope that you have enjoyed this episode. Please note that the Dividend Guy Blog podcast is at no time issuing buy or sell recommendation. Please do your own due diligence as this podcast is recorded for information and hopefully fun purposes only. Make your research, make sure you do your stuff. We're not responsible for your losses or your profit after listening to this episode. And until next one, stay invested.